Joining me today is a truth seeker, a self-experimenter, a brain food expert, and author of the upcoming book, Genius Foods, Max Lugavere. Welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me.
To the Rubin Report. This is a back, although most of my audience now will not know you from the Rubin Report, but you used to do the old Rubin Report. Seems like a real lifetime ago, doesn't it?
Yeah. Back in the day when it was a panel show.
It was a panel show years ago on TYT. I don't even know what we were doing. I have almost no recollection of my life at that time.
It's, that every time that I was on it though, I would always have such a good time, and I always would think to myself, like, how good you are at what you do. And so I'm just so honored to be here in this new set and to see your success. The fact that you've just blown up, it's awesome.
Cool, well thank you, and I feel the same, and I'm glad that our paths have sort of, been on parallel tracks kind of growing together.
Yeah.
You have a new book coming out, which we're going to talk about shortly. The last time I saw you, though, was about 2 or 2.5 years ago. You had me eat some really nasty stuff on camera that you felt, I don't even know why you had me eat it, but you wanted me to eat. What did we eat?
Yeah, we ate.
Because you're doing a lot about food.
Yeah.
So you're testing this stuff out all the time.
Exactly.
What is it that we ate?
We ate natto, which is a fermented soybean dish that is very commonly consumed in Japan. And that was my first time ever trying it because I think, back where your old set was, we were like a few blocks away from like a Japanese market.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, what a great place to go and try to find this food that I've heard so much about because of its purported health benefits, but I'd never tasted it. And it's known for being particularly gnarly. Like it smells like dirty socks.
Yeah.
And I knew that you were back at the studio, and I was like, what, there's no better time to try this gnarly food than with my friend Dave Rubin. So I brought it back, and we tried it, and I don't think you were that into it.
It was pretty nasty.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a pretty open eater, and we're going to get a lot into the different types of things that you should be eating, and fermented food, obviously good. But it was kind of like beans in this gooey, sticky sauce, and it stunk to high hell.
It's got the...
But you're saying it was good for my brain.
It's very good. It's very good. Yeah, it's the top known source of vitamin K2, which is a really important vitamin for maintaining calcium homeostasis in the body. Basically keeping calcium in the parts of your body where calcium should be, like your bones and your teeth, and out of your soft tissues, like your kidneys and your arteries and stuff like that. There's really good research on vitamin K2. And natto is one of these foods. They eat it in, one of the world's blue zones. So I just figured, why not give it a try? I always say it has the consistency of like baked beans with a little bit of like personal lubricant twirled together, which is obviously not appealing.
That sounds quite horrific.
Yeah.
I should have had something here for you to taste on camera.
That would have been awesome. Like kicking the ball back.
Yeah, something like that. All right, maybe next time. All right, so first, I thought what we'd start off with, before we get to the book, is I think sort of what you're doing is interesting because it kind of parallels what I'm doing here, where we're watching mainstream media crumble and people are coming to people like me, perhaps, and Shapiro and Joe Rogan and all these alternate voices to hear about news. And I also think that's happening in the food world and the diet world as well, where you used to maybe watch the nightly news to find out what you're supposed to eat, what the latest fad is, what oils you're not supposed to have, et cetera, et cetera. And now people are going to people like Joe Rogan, who I just mentioned, Tim Ferriss, people like you. Did you sort of see that thing coming, and that's why you started getting into this world? And we'll talk a little bit about the personal reasons why you got in just a sec.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an amazing point. I feel that, look, we live in a time, and in a world where we have all of the world's information at our fingertips at any given time with our smartphones, and research is out there. Information wants to be free. So, whereas prior generations, I feel like, could have only received health information from the doctor or nutrition information from the nutritionist. Today, I think things are different where people that are passionate and that do their homework in a way. I'm not just talking about going to media for their health information, but PubMed is something that anybody can search. It's the research is out there. Not everybody's going to be qualified to the degree that they can understand, for example, medical literature or even cut through the jargon. But there's a lot that people can glean from what is readily available. I mean, one of the ways that I try to tell people to become educated about health and science and research is to look at websites that put out university press releases that often accompany studies, like Science Daily, for example, or Medical Express. Oftentimes when a study is released, the university will write a press release that basically has the gist of what the study basically found in layman's terms. And that's often what journalists will use to write pieces for like the Huffington Post or Fast Company. So what I tell people to do is cut out the middleman, go to the press releases, read them, then go to the research article, compare what you read in layman's terms in the press release to the research article, and that can actually help you interpret research.
So the average person, though, obviously is not going to do all that legwork.
True.
And I think that's where someone like you comes in going, I will sit down, read all this stuff, and now distill it to you in a way that makes some sense.
Yeah, well, my background, I mean, before really diving into health and nutrition and fitness, I was a journalist, at Current TV, which was my first job out of college. And so getting to work with the journalists there, Peabody award-winning journalists, award-winning storytellers, it gave me a sense of how to ask questions, how to pick my sources. And then when I became interested in nutrition and health, I kind of knew not only where to look, but how to look. And my unique job gave me the time and the ability and, my personal circumstances. And so, I don't expect everybody to do their own research, but I do think that people should do their own research. I do think that the healthcare is something that we like to pretend that we're able to sort of offload to our healthcare providers, right? But you don't go to a doctor to be healthy. You go to a doctor to become free of disease or to have a disease treated. I think healthcare really is something that, starts in the kitchen and in the gym, and it's something that we have to imbue our lives with day to day.
Yeah, and I wanted to start with that because I think it sets the table properly, because I know on YouTube there's a million people talking about health and diets and all that stuff, and I want people to understand that you're somebody that I know has been in this for a long time, actually doing the research. So let's go to that personal circumstance part that you mentioned. You sort of got into this, it's probably only about 5 years ago with the circumstances with your mom, and I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, so when I left Current TV to sort of figure out where I was going to go with my career, it was sort of in that downtime in between jobs that my mom started displaying very strange symptoms that I couldn't explain. I mean, memory, problems with her memory. She complained of brain fog, and she also had changes to her gait that were very apparent. I mean, my mom is a spirited New Yorker. New Yorkers walk very fast. They walk everywhere. And my mom ran a business, so cognitively she was always very sharp. And essentially what we saw is that my mom's cognition took it just seemed to have like a web browser with too many open tabs is how I describe it. It just, like a stuttering frame rate on a YouTube video with a poor internet connection. And my mom's gait changed where, before she was a very fast walker, she almost developed sort of like a shuffle. And both of these strange symptoms seemed to come on at once. And I had no prior family history of any neurodegenerative disease. Dementia to me was not a term that I was familiar with. I didn't know what Alzheimer's disease was. Actually, when I thought about the word dementia, I thought about that character from the Addams Family movie, like it was like Cousin Itz or Fester's, Crush or something. Her name was Dementia, which was actually pretty funny. But so coinciding with my ignorance, I had the time to go with my mom to some of the top neurology departments in the country. We were very fortunate to be able to do that. We went to NYU, Columbia in New York, Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, the Cleveland Clinic. All in hopes of trying to find some kind of diagnosis for my mom to see what was going on. And it was in 2011 at the Cleveland Clinic where my mom was diagnosed with a neurodegenerative disease for the first time. And she was prescribed drugs for both Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease. And at that moment, I mean, my world pretty much stopped. I'm a pretty chill guy. That weekend, or that week in Cleveland, it was the first time in my life that I'd ever had a panic attack. I was just so freaked out by the possibility that my mom had this fatal disease for which there is no cure or particularly meaningful treatment. And I basically became unable to think about anything else, let alone my career. I ended up, my mom started taking the drugs. I ended up coming back to LA to try to, look for jobs and do what it is that you do when you live in LA and you're a journalist on TV. And I basically became unable to think about anything other than nutrition. You know, every waking minute that I wasn't, you know, doing something career related, I was in PubMed digging through the research. And what I think really motivated this journey for me was the fact that what I uncovered in the research was a stark contrast to the, you know, what neuroscientist Norman Doidge calls neurological nihilism, to the despair and bleakness that I experienced in those doctors' offices with my mom.
Yeah. Can you describe what that is? Like,
Yeah.
what are they actually telling you at that point? That is the despair.
Yeah. So I call it diagnose and adios. You know, basically there's a quote that I learned that is circulated amongst medical school students that neurologists don't treat disease, they admire it. That's because the brain is a mystery for the most part. I mean, we know quite a bit about the brain, which is surprising, but there's a lot more unknowns than knowns at this point. And treatments for neurological diseases are very limited. You know, there's no approved drug for Alzheimer's disease that has a disease-modifying treatment. They only act as Band-Aids, like chemical Band-Aids essentially, that work to sort of artificially boost neurotransmitters in the brain, but they do nothing to solve the underlying pathology. And you know, drug trials are notoriously bad. Pfizer just announced, for example, that they're going to stop pursuing pharmaceutical treatments for Alzheimer's disease because treating the quest to find a drug to treat the disease has like a 99.6% fail rate. That's worse than any other, you know, disease.
So meaning that they're getting out of the game altogether? They view this as something that can't be solved via drugs? I mean, that sounds incredible. I don't know how often that happens with other diseases, but that sounds pretty staggering.
Yeah, I mean, another huge pharmaceutical company basically recently announced the same thing, Axivant. Yeah, it's a massive fail rate. So think about it from like the perspective of an investor. You know, are you going to invest in an Alzheimer's or in any drug trial that has, you know, a 99.6% fail rate? It's, you know, it's just not a smart investment. And that's why Alzheimer's disease research is criminally underfunded, or I shouldn't say criminally, it makes sense, although it's tragic because, you know, if there was a pill tomorrow that I could give my mom that would help in a meaningful way, of course I would want it. And I would want it for all the 5 million people in America that are suffering from Alzheimer's disease. But
interesting, you know, because I can bring almost anything back to politics. It's like this is a good argument for publicly funded scientific research because it doesn't have to deal with the bottom line. Where you're saying, yeah, these companies, they have to deal with the bottom line and shareholders, and they have to then stop at some point if they can't get far enough. Where something publicly funded, they can keep going to the science, hopefully. Although you found that there are some other ways to deal with this, and that's really what changed your life.
Yeah, so so on the one hand, I became really interested in learning about potential diet and lifestyle interventions that I could throw my mom's way to sort of help her. But then at the same time, I became really conscious of my own brain health because I learned that changes begin in the brain decades before the first symptom of Alzheimer's disease, which is just one form of dementia. But even Parkinson's disease, by the time you show your first symptom of Parkinson's disease, half of the neurons involved in movement in the part of the brain associated with Parkinson's disease are already dead. So these are not, like any chronic disease, these are not diseases that develop overnight. They take years, if not decades, to develop. And I became really interested in doing what I could do in my own life to maximize my brain health so that I might not have to deal with what it is that my mom is dealing with.
Yeah, so we'll go from there and we'll slightly shift to your book. Obviously, this is all intertwined. This is the advanced copy. The book comes out in a couple weeks. And I was reading a little bit, and I just thought that the opening alone was really perfect. So I'm just going to read the opening paragraph. Unless, do you want to read it in your own voice? Maybe you should. You know what?
Okay.
I'm going to let you read the opening paragraph of your book.
Oh, man.
I thought it was pretty beautiful.
Thank you so much, yeah. Nestled within your skull, mere inches from your eyes, are 86 billion of the most efficient transistors in the known universe. This neural network is you, running the operating system we know as life, and no computer yet conceived comes close to its awesome capabilities. Forged over millions and millions of years of life on Earth, your brain is capable of storing nearly 8,000 iPhones worth of information. Everything you are, do, love, feel, care for, long for, and aspire to is enabled by an incredibly complex, invisible symphony of neurological processes. Elegant, seamless, and blisteringly fast, when scientists try to simulate just 1 second of a human brain's abilities. It took supercomputers 40 minutes to do so. So yeah, I mean, the brain we each are heir to this amazing birthright, forged over millions and millions of years of life on Earth. And yet the modern world is fighting it at every turn, from the toxic industrial products that have saturated the food supply, to the dietary advice that we've been given for decades, to now the fact that the pendulum is sort of swinging the other direction and it's sort of like a dietary free-for-all,
Yeah, so all right, let's shift to my dietary free-for-all.
Yes, I want to talk about
For a second.
Yes.
So you know that at the moment I am in the middle of this sort of slow carb diet, this high fat, no sugar, no carb diet. I've actually, in about, as of this taping, in about 9 days, I've lost about 3 pounds. Pretty good. Awesome. I actually feel pretty good. I have these like brief moments where I want to punch random people. I think I'm being a little meaner on Twitter than I normally would be, for real. I mean, like, there is just like a little bit of mood stuff, but my energy feels pretty good.
That's great.
I'm not getting that sort of crash from coffee that you might get at like 2 o'clock that then has people drinking all kinds of chemicals that after their 2:30 feeling or whatever that is.
Right.
So I basically feel pretty good. It's pretty much just meat and fish and veggies, and a lot of butter. And you said to me right before we started, maybe the butter isn't the great grass-fed butter.
Yeah, well, grass-fed butter is definitely good. I mean, there's definitely trace nutrients in it, vitamin K2, which we talked about earlier, CLA, which is being studied as a potential cancer fighter and fat burner. But it's one of the hallmarks of a healthy food is nutrient density. When you take any concentrated fat, butter, oil, they're not very nutrient dense. They've got a lot of calories, 9 calories per gram. A tablespoon of oil has 140 calories. And it's a lot of calories with very little nutrients. And there's, on butter alone, there's not a lot of evidence to say that butter improves fat burning or brain health or anything like that. So, I like to tell people that, consuming fat, the high fat, low carb diet, if you already have fat, all you need is the low carb. Your body has the fat to burn.
Right. So your body's going to go to your fat, probably in your stomach area, as opposed to what a lot of people are doing with these diets is you're loading up on fat to sort of get the body going on fat, and then the hope is that then it goes to your fat.
Yeah, your body's going to want to burn the fat that you're consuming before it burns the fat that you have around your waist. And the point of a diet like this, I would assume, is to lose some of the fat around your waist.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think this conversation is so interesting, because Tim Ferriss is the one that sort of did the slow carb thing first, or the 4-hour body, whatever it is. And it's like, well, all right, he's focusing on that part, the weight loss part, so I am seeing some results on that front.
Yeah.
You're focusing on the brain part, which is also very important to me. You know what I mean? I'm someone that likes to know what I'm talking about and be able to have clean thoughts and all that.
Of course. I like to focus on the weight part too. I mean, that's a concern for, I think, everybody, and it's a good way also to just have this conversation about nutrition and healthy eating. When you start a low carb diet, you're going to lose a lot of water weight at first, because what you're doing is you're depleting the amount of glycogen stored in your muscles. Glycogen is basically how your muscles and liver store sugar. But for every gram of glycogen that your muscles store, you also store about 3 to 4 grams of water. So that's why once you start depleting the glycogen from your muscles with vigorous exercise or just by not eating a lot of carbs, you lose a lot of water weight very quickly. And that's also why when people stop eating low carb and go back to eating a higher carb diet, their weight just shoots up because their muscles end up storing all that glycogen along with all that, with 4 parts water for every 1 gram, 1 part of sugar stored.
I think what we're going to have to do is, like, in a month from now, if I can keep running with this thing, I'll have to have you and Ferriss on together. You guys can like poke me, you can poke my brain area, he can poke my stomach, and we'll figure out
Sounds great.
What happened here. All right, so enough about my diet. People, I guess, will see the results right here on the YouTube. Okay, so you start realizing that the medicine for dementia, Alzheimer's, these cognitive degenerative diseases is not quite there. You start changing your own diet, but then also realize, well, this is how I can also sort of help my mom and help other people like this. So what are some of the first things that you realized that we as people generally are doing wrong?
Yeah, well, definitely, my diet used to be dictated by what sort of conventional wisdom was surrounding a healthy diet. So I used to base my diet around grains. I used to basically shun white carbs, white rice, white bread, as if it were some kind of toxin. But if you put a huge bowl of brown rice in front of me, I would go to town on it, often asking for seconds. Every meal had to include a grain, and I would notice that my energy levels throughout the day always felt like a roller coaster. You know, I couldn't really go many hours after waking without eating something right away. And in between lunch and dinner, I would often find myself starving. And, you know, when I started looking into the research, I realized that there's really no good evidence to say that grains improve health. I mean, certainly if you're metabolically healthy, you can tolerate grains, which is not the case for 50% of the people living in America that are either pre-diabetic or diabetic and have essentially become glucose or carbohydrate intolerant. If you're healthy, though, you can eat, you know, rice, and you can certainly incorporate it as a means of, you know, improving athletic performance. But that was like really the first thing that I did, you know, because my diet was never very high in added sugars. I started cutting out the breads and the rices and all that stuff and the pastas. And I noticed that my energy levels just, you know, not only did they go through the roof, but they were more stable throughout the day. And, you know, without even really trying, my body composition changed. I started, you know, losing fat, which is something that was just like a side bonus.
Yeah.
And again, you know, the recommendations to eat grains, because many people do consider them healthy. You know, how could quinoa or brown rice be anything but healthy? Come from misguided, you know, nutrition policy over the past 50 years that have really been attributed to the Mediterranean dietary pattern. That's this nebulous idea of how people in the Mediterranean eat, because epidemiological research, observational population-based research, shows that they have reduced rates of cardiovascular disease and neurological disease. But when you look at randomized control trials, which are the kinds of trials required to prove cause and effect, there's no good evidence to say that grains improve health. In fact, when you look at research control trials with people with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes or obesity, low-carb diets seem to win most of the time when compared to standard low-fat, you know, conventional dietary wisdom.
Yeah, so let's back up for a second, because you said something really interesting that just sort of rolled off your tongue, but it seems pretty freaking staggering and scary. 50% of Americans are either pre-diabetic or diabetic?
Yeah, that's what the latest statistics.
So what does pre-diabetic actually mean?
So when you're pre-diabetic, your blood sugar is higher than it should be. That's what a doctor will measure, and they'll say you should probably, you know, change up your diet because you are at risk for becoming a type 2 diabetic. It's sort of like this middle ground where, yeah, your blood sugar is higher than it should be.
Do they know how much that number has changed over the years? I suspect since probably the 50s, when we started all this processed food and sugars and all of that stuff, and soft drinks and everything else, that must have tremendously increased that number.
Yeah, I mean, it's skyrocketed in tandem with, you know, the obesity rates in this country. 2/3 of people are either overweight or obese. And they've kind of, you know, risen in tandem with one another. And the only thing that can really explain it is the environment, you know, because our genes certainly haven't changed over the past 100 years as a population. So what has? Well, the food supply. And, you know, there's a lot of zealotry in the world of nutrition. It's a very, you know, people tend to feel very religious about their nutritious beliefs. But, you know, in general, what I think most people would agree on is that there's become a ubiquity of hyper-processed foods that are rich in both readily, easily digestible carbohydrates, pulverized grains stripped of their nutrients, and added fats. And, you know, both of these foods put together basically create a stereotypical junk food. And that's really what most people are consuming these days. I mean, 60% of calories that Americans consume come from these exact kinds of foods, ultra-processed foods.
I always think of that commercial, I don't know if they're still running it, but it's with Larry the Cable Guy for Prilosec OTC.
Yeah.
And, you know, he's out there eating the hot dogs and all this stuff, and he's basically like, you can eat whatever you want as long as you have your Prilosec OTC.
Right, just take a pill.
And it's like, the pill is the answer. You know, he's a pretty heavy guy in the first place. I have no problem with him.
Yeah.
But it's like that we go to do whatever the hell you want, and then here's our magic pill for it. Probably not the best way to be dealing with our health.
Not the best way at all. I mean, and the thing is, you know, one of the main drivers of type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, which is the hallmark of type 2 diabetes, is chronically elevated levels of insulin, which could precede a diagnosis of even prediabetes by a decade. So, I mean, people are walking around eating, on average, 300 grams of carbohydrates per day, exactly from the kinds of foods that we're talking about, hyper-processed foods. And it's just doing a number on our metabolisms, our waistlines, and in Genius Foods we explore what it's doing to our brains and our mental function and our moods.
Yeah, all right, so that's really where I want to focus on this, because I think that's your expertise, and I just find that fascinating, because I think there's a lot of things happening right now that might be changing some of our brain chemistry and how we think and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So at any point when this was happening with your mom, did any doctor say maybe she should change her diet, this or that, or really?
Not once, yeah. And again, I've been to all of the most storied, U.S. News and, whatever the annual, ranking of hospitals in America is. Mm-hmm. We went to the top hospitals to try to find a diagnosis, and not once was diet mentioned at all. And, there's not conclusive evidence on how diet can affect somebody who has the disease, although it's starting to bubble up in the literature. But yeah, I mean, exercise wasn't really mentioned, even though exercise is one of the best ways to treat. The guidelines for treating mild cognitive impairment were literally just updated 2 weeks ago to include exercise as a means of treatment for people with mild cognitive impairment, which is sort of like pre-dementia, which often converts to diseases like Alzheimer's disease. But yeah, so I became fixated on these sort of alternate approaches to treatment and even possibly prevention. When I had that experience with my mom, because I've always been a big believer in the power of diet and lifestyle. I've just seen it play out in my own life. I mean, I go to the gym and I'm a different person walking out of the gym than I am walking into the gym.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever cobwebs I have in my head are gone.
Yeah.
Excised. Like the demons, are excised with a good workout.
Yeah.
And yet, that's not something that I feel like is common wisdom. So when this all happened to my mom, I started, researching, and I realized that there's a lot of, insight out there, both in terms of risk factors for developing dementia. For example, take the Mediterranean dietary pattern, which we talked about before, which is associated with reduced risks of many chronic diseases.
Yeah. Can you explain to people what that is? I mean, it's basically a lot of oils. And
yeah, so it's like characterized by being really high in extra virgin olive oil.
Yeah.
A glass of wine per day for women, 1 to 2 for men. And then the way that it's typically defined in the medical literature is as being it's defined as being a grain-based diet, and it all stems back from this one epidemiologist named Ansel Keys, who basically in the 1950s stationed himself on the island of Crete to look at how that population basically ate and went about their lives. In the midst of a major epidemic of heart disease in the United States, he wanted to see what they were doing differently in the Mediterranean region of the world, that we might be able to glean some nutritional insight. But the problem is and this is a story that's been told by other people. There's a great book called The Big Fat Surprise, where the journalist who wrote it really goes into depth on this story, but I talk about it as well in Genius Foods. He was stationed on the island during Lent, so it was a particularly lean time just after World War II. And his observation of their dietary pattern was one where, it was predominantly grain-based, but people in the Mediterranean region, they love fatty cuts of meat. I have friends who are born there and who visit, very frequently, and they eat very fatty cuts of, meat, lamb, for example.
Yeah.
Yet that's all but ignored in the medical textbook definition of the Mediterranean diet. And also, when you're observing a population as well as what it is that they're eating, it's impossible to ascribe causality to any dietary element, because what you're observing is basically, you're doing just that. You're observing variables, but without doing a randomized control trial, it's impossible to prove which aspects of that diet are causally related to the phenotypes, the outcomes that you're seeing in terms of the population health.
Right.
So
that could partly also just because of geography and lifestyle, weather, the amount they move around.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's cold, you might need a little more fat on your bones, et
exactly.
cetera, et cetera.
You don't know, so you need a randomized control trial to do that. So what I argue in the book is that what you see in terms of the health of people living in that region of the world is not because of the grains that they're eating, but in spite of the grains that they're eating. Because when you actually look at what grains are, it's a whole lot of starch wrapped in a little bit of insoluble fiber and a tiny amount of vitamins. When building a healthy diet, we want to really look for things that are nutrient dense, that the brain needs. So, one of the recommendations that I make to people generally is to consume a huge salad, a fatty salad every single day. Rather than eating a bowl of brown rice, which is pretty nutritionally sparse, dark leafy greens contain a bevy of micronutrients that the brain actually needs to create energy. And there's really good research, actually. A study was just published from Rush University that found that people that consume a large bowl of dark leafy greens per day have brains that look on scans 11 years younger.
Wow.
So, yeah. So, I mean, there's...
And you also realize with some of this stuff that you're not missing much, actually. I mean,
Yeah.
even just in this, week and whatever that I'm doing this diet, I got a poke bowl yesterday, and I usually get brown rice on the bottom, but I got the leafy greens instead, and I actually, in a way, I enjoyed it more, and I felt kind of slimmer after because, yeah, you're just taking in all that rice.
Well, you're going to feel much better. I mean, your body, makes a lot of effort to keep certain things within a very narrow margin. So, for example, your body temperature is one of those things that your body works really hard to keep with, hovering at around 98.6 degrees, right? The same thing with your blood sugar. At any given time, you've got, 1 teaspoon of circulating sugar in your body. And your pancreas works very hard to keep your circulating blood sugar at that level. The minute you eat a massive bowl of brown rice or drink, a glass of orange juice, which so many Americans begin their day with, which contains about 6 to 7 teaspoons of pure sugar, that's like a deluge of glucose being shuttled straight into your blood that the vast majority of people don't need. Where's that sugar going to go? Most likely it's going to end up on your hips and on your waist.
Yeah. So basically soft drinks, I mean, I think everyone sort of knows this at this
Yes.
point and drinks it despite the knowledge, or at least the knowledge is readily accessible. Soft drinks are pretty much the worst thing you can drink, right? I mean, the amount of sugar there is just insane.
Horrible, yeah. I mean, there's no, requirement for consuming added sugar. A lot of people actually feel that they need sugar to fuel their brain because of the boost in executive function that they feel, after consuming a food that's sugary or a granola bar or any carb-rich food. But really, so many people are hooked on glucose as a fuel for the brain that in reality what they're doing is they're treating their withdrawal from sugar from the previous meal. Mm-hmm. And that's why they feel a boost.
So basically you have a soda at lunch and then you're having that crash like 2 hours later and you're like, oh, I need that bar that has...
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it tricks you. There's a good reason that you feel tricked and that you feel like these foods are your friends. Because, when you're on that sort of glucose roller coaster throughout the day, you need those constant pick-me-ups, and that's the problem. So what I think, is a more sustainable way of having energy, cognitive resilience, is to step off of that train, the glucose train, and really reacquaint yourself with healthy fats and foods that are much lower in carbohydrates and much richer in the nutrients that your brain actually needs.